An old family photo from 1885. Looks normal until experts found a hidden hand. The storage unit in Rochester, New York hadn't been opened in 43 years. Laura Chen stood at its entrance on a gray March morning in 2024, watching as the auction company workers hauled out decades of accumulated family possessions. Furniture wrapped in moth-eaten blankets, boxes of yellowed documents, trunks filled with clothing that smelled of camphor and thyme. As a curator for the New York State Historical Society, Laura specialized in 19th century photography. She'd learned to spot valuable historical images among estate sale clutter, and she never missed local auctions. Today, she was looking through boxes of photographs that had belonged to the estate of Dorothy Whitman, who had died at 97 without direct heirs. Most of the photographs were unremarkable, 20th century snapshots of vacations and birthdays, the mundane visual record of an ordinary life. But at the bottom of the third box, wrapped in tissue paper and protected by a leather portfolio, Laura found something that made her pause. The photograph was mounted on thick cardboard, the kind professional photographers used in the 1880s. The image showed a family of 7 posed on the front porch of a substantial farmhouse, white clapboard siding, decorative trim, a wide porch with turned wooden posts. The family stood arranged in typical Victorian formality, father at the center, mother to his right, 4 children of varying ages flanking them. Everyone wore their finest clothing. Everyone stared at the camera with that rigid, unsmiling expression that long exposure times demanded. The photographer's mark was embossed in gold at the bottom. Garrett and Sons. Photography, Palmyra, New York, August 1885. Laura studied the image carefully. The composition was standard, the poses conventional. A perfectly ordinary family portrait from the Gilded Age. She almost set it aside, but something nagged at her attention. The father's expression wasn't just formal, it was tense. The mother's hands, folded in her lap, were clenched so tightly that even in the faded photograph, Laura could see the white of her knuckles. And the youngest daughter, perhaps 8 years old, wasn't looking at the camera at all. Her eyes were directed downward toward the porch floor, and her face held something that looked like terror. Laura pulled out her phone and used its camera to zoom in on different sections of the photograph. She examined each family member's face, their posture, the details of their clothing and surroundings. Then she moved to the porch itself, studying the wooden floorboards, the shadows cast by the afternoon sun. That's when she saw it. Between 2 of the porch floorboards, in a gap that might have been an inch wide, there was something that shouldn't be there. Laura zoomed in further, her heart beginning to race. It was a hand, or rather the fingers of a hand, reaching up through the gap from the darkness beneath the porch. The fingers were extended, stretched as if trying to reach something or signal someone. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She looked again at the family's faces, seeing them now with new understanding. They weren't just posing stiffly, they were terrified. And beneath them, under the very boards they stood on, someone was trapped. Laura purchased the entire box of photographs for $80 and drove directly back to her office in Albany. She set up her examination equipment, high-resolution scanner, magnification software, archival lighting, and began a systematic analysis of the 1885 photograph. The digital scan revealed details impossible to see with the naked eye. The hand beneath the porch was definitely real, not a shadow or artifact of the photographic process. She could make out individual fingers, the curve of knuckles, even what appeared to be dirt or blood darkening the skin. The hand was positioned palm up, fingers slightly curved, in what looked like a gesture of desperate supplication. Laura zoomed in on the family members' faces. The father, perhaps 45 years old, had a hard, closed expression, not grief or fear, but something more like grim determination. The mother looked haunted, her eyes red-rimmed even in the sepia tones of the old photograph. The oldest son, maybe 17, stood rigid with his arms at his sides, his jaw clenched. The 2 middle daughters kept their eyes carefully averted from the camera. Only the youngest child was looking down, unable to maintain the pretense that nothing was wrong. Laura began her research with the photographer's mark. Garrett and Sons had been a successful photography studio operating in Palmyra, New York from 1878 to 1903. She found advertisements in the local newspaper, the Palmyra Courier, offering family portraits taken at your residence and likenesses guaranteed to satisfy. The studio had served the rural communities surrounding Palmyra, traveling to farmhouses to photograph families who couldn't easily come to town. Next, she needed to identify the family in the photograph. The farmhouse was distinctive. The decorative gingerbread trim and the specific arrangement of windows might help locate it if the building still stood. Laura posted the image on a historical preservation forum, asking if anyone recognized the architecture or location. While waiting for responses, she turned to newspaper archives from August 1885. If something significant had happened in Palmyra that month, the local paper would have covered it. She started with the front pages, looking for major stories, accidents, crimes. She found it on August 19, 1885, a small article on page 3. Local youth missing, family seeks information. The article was brief. Michael Garrett, age 16, son of prominent farmer Joseph Garrett, has not been seen since the evening of August 15th. The young man left the family's farm on Canandaigua Road, stating he was going to town but never arrived. Anyone with information regarding his whereabouts should contact the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. Laura's hands were shaking. The photograph was dated August 1885. A 16-year-old boy from the Garrett family had disappeared on August 15th. How soon after that had the family photograph been taken? And why would a family pose for a formal portrait just days after their son went missing? Unless they knew exactly where he was. Laura spent the next week immersed in the Palmyra Courier's archives, tracing the story of Michael Garrett's disappearance. The coverage was sparse and grew thinner as weeks passed. After the initial missing person notice, there were only 2 more brief mentions. One on August 26th, still no word on missing youth, and a final one on September 10th. Sheriff concludes search for Garrett boy. The September article contained a quote from Sheriff Thomas Bradford. After thorough investigation, we have concluded that young Michael Garrett likely left home of his own accord, perhaps to seek employment in the city. While the family remains concerned, there is no evidence of foul play. The matter is considered closed unless new information emerges. But Laura noticed what the articles didn't say. There was no mention of search parties, no interviews with people who might have seen Michael, no description of where the sheriff's investigation had led. For a prominent farming family's son to vanish should have generated more attention, more sustained effort. The investigation had been cursory at best, deliberately superficial at worst. She pulled property records for Canandaigua Road in 1885. The Garrett farm comprised 240 acres of prime agricultural land. Joseph Garrett had purchased it in 1870 and built it into one of the most successful operations in Wayne County. Tax records showed substantial wealth. The property was valued at $15,000, an enormous sum for the time. Joseph Garrett was listed as a director of the Palmyra Savings Bank and a trustee of the local Presbyterian Church. A powerful man, the kind of man whose family tragedy might be handled with discretion rather than publicity. Laura needed to find the family, to discover if any descendants still lived in the area who might have stories passed down through generations. She worked through genealogical records, tracing the Garrett family forward through time. Joseph and his wife Mary had 6 children. Michael, born 1869, Robert, born 1871, Elizabeth, born 1873, Caroline, born 1875, and the youngest, whom Laura had seen in the photograph looking down at the porch floor, Sarah, born 1877. Michael had no death certificate on file in New York State, no marriage record, no obituary. After August 15th, 1885, 16-year-old Michael Garrett simply ceased to exist in the official record. But the other children's records were traceable. Robert had inherited the farm and died in 1924. Elizabeth had married and moved to Syracuse. Caroline had died young, at 23, of tuberculosis. And Sarah, the youngest, the one whose terrified eyes in the photograph haunted Laura, had lived until 1963, dying at age 86 in a nursing home in Rochester. Laura felt her pulse quicken. Sarah would have been 8 years old when the photograph was taken, 8 years old when her brother Michael disappeared, old enough to remember, old enough to have carried secrets for 78 years. The nursing home where Sarah died no longer existed, but Laura tracked down the company that had purchased its records. After several phone calls and a formal research request, she received a scanned copy of Sarah's admission file. Among the standard medical and financial documents was a single sheet labeled Emergency Contact Information and Family History. Under special notes, someone had written in blue ink, "Patient occasionally speaks of what happened to Michael, becomes agitated, recommend not pressing for details, appears to be a source of significant trauma." Laura needed to understand the exact timeline. When had the photograph been taken in relation to Michael's disappearance? The newspaper said he'd vanished on August 15th. The photograph was dated simply August 1885, but professional photographers typically kept detailed appointment books recording when and where they took portraits. She contacted the Palmyra Historical Society, explaining her research. The volunteer coordinator was enthusiastic. They had a small archive of materials from local businesses, including some records from Garrett and Sons photography studio. Within 2 days, Laura was sitting in the Historical Society's cramped research room, carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound appointment ledger from 1885. The handwriting was neat and methodical. Each entry listed the client's name, address, date of appointment, and type of photograph commissioned. Laura's fingers trembled as she turned to August. August 5, Harrison family, 4 subjects, indoor portrait. August 7th, Whitmore wedding, bride and groom, outdoor setting. August 12th, Thompson family, 6 subjects, parlor setting. August 17th, Garrett family, Canandaigua Road, outdoor porch setting. August 17th, 2 days after Michael was reported missing. Laura stared at the entry, her mind racing. The family had hired a photographer to come to their farm 2 days after their teenage son had vanished. They had stood on their porch, dressed in their finest clothes, and posed for a formal family portrait while Michael was... what? Where? Under the porch. That's where the hand was reaching from, under the very porch where his family stood posing. Laura photographed the ledger page, then continued reading through the entries. On September 3rd, there was another appointment at the Garrett farm. Return to Garrett residence to deliver finished portraits and take additional photographs as requested. The photographer had returned to the Garrett farm 2 weeks later. Had the hand still been visible then? Had anyone noticed it when the finished portraits were delivered? She found one more relevant entry, dated September 10th, the same day the newspaper announced the sheriff was closing the investigation. J. Garrett declined additional portrait work, seemed agitated, did not invite me into house as before. Transaction conducted on porch, paid in full, but suggested I not return. The Historical Society volunteer, an elderly woman named Margaret, noticed Laura's expression. Found something interesting? The Garrett family, Laura said carefully. Do you know anything about them? Any local stories? Margaret's expression shifted, became guarded. That's old history. Most of the old families around here have skeletons they'd rather stayed buried. What kind of skeletons? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed and closed the door to the research room. My grandmother lived in Palmyra her whole life. She used to tell stories about the old days, things that happened but nobody talked about officially. The Garrett farm was one of those stories. Laura waited, barely breathing. There was a son who disappeared, Margaret continued. Never found. The official story was he ran away, went to find work in Buffalo or Rochester. But my grandmother said the neighbors knew better. Said there'd been shouting that night, terrible sounds coming from the Garrett house. One neighbor, lived on the adjacent farm, told his family he'd heard a young man's voice begging, pleading, and then silence. Margaret's grandmother had been friends with the daughter of the neighboring family, the Pritchards, who owned the farm directly east of the Garrett property. Laura dove back into records, tracing the Pritchard family history. Samuel Pritchard had owned 180 acres adjacent to Joseph Garrett's land. The families would have known each other well, shared equipment and labor during harvest, attended the same church. In the Palmyra Historical Society's vertical files, those manila folders of miscellaneous documents organized by family name, Laura found a treasure. Someone in the 1970s had conducted oral history interviews with elderly residents, recording their memories of 19th century Palmyra. Among the transcripts was an interview with Harold Pritchard, Samuel's grandson, conducted in 1976 when Harold was 89 years old. The interviewer had asked about the old farming families, and Harold had mentioned the Garretts. Laura read the transcript with growing horror. My father was 15 in 1885, old enough to remember clearly. He told me about the night of August 15th. He'd been in the barn late, tending to a sick cow, and he heard shouting coming from the Garrett place. Their house was maybe 400 yards from ours, close enough to hear raised voices on a quiet summer night. My father said it sounded like an argument between Joseph Garrett and his oldest son, Michael. He heard Michael's voice clearly. I won't keep quiet about it. What you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell them. Then there was more shouting, and my father heard what sounded like a fight. Furniture being knocked over, glass breaking. He thought about going to investigate, but was afraid. Joseph Garrett was a hard man, not someone you crossed lightly. After a while, everything went quiet. My father went back to the house and told his own father what he'd heard. The next day, word spread that Michael Garrett had disappeared. When the sheriff came asking questions, my grandfather told him what my father had heard. But Sheriff Bradford said it was just a family dispute, nothing unusual, and boys Michael's age often ran away after arguments with their fathers. The investigation went nowhere. But here's what always stuck with my father. 3 days after Michael disappeared, the Garretts had a photographer come out to take a family picture. My father saw the photographer's wagon go past our farm. He thought it was the strangest thing. Your son disappears and you hire a photographer? It didn't sit right with him. He said the whole family seemed to change after that summer. They kept to themselves more, didn't socialize like before, and none of them ever spoke Michael's name again, as if he'd never existed. Laura set down the transcript, her hands shaking. The pieces were forming a picture she could barely stand to contemplate. Michael had discovered something his father was doing, something wrong enough that he'd threatened to expose it. They'd fought, and then Michael had disappeared. But what had Joseph Garrett been doing that was worth killing his own son to hide? She returned to the financial records, examining Joseph Garrett's business dealings more carefully. As a director of Palmyra Savings Bank, he would have had access to depositors' funds, knowledge of who had money and who was desperate. Laura searched for any irregularities, any scandals involving the bank in the mid-1880s. She found the answer in a Syracuse newspaper from November 1885, 3 months after Michael's disappearance. Palmyra Bank director accused of embezzlement scheme. The Syracuse Herald's article from November 12, 1885, was detailed and damning. Joseph Garrett, respected farmer and bank director, had been systematically embezzling funds from the Palmyra Savings Bank for at least 2 years. The scheme was sophisticated. Garrett had created false accounts using the names of deceased depositors, then gradually transferred money into these phantom accounts before withdrawing it for his own use. The fraud had totaled nearly $23,000, a staggering sum in 1885, equivalent to roughly $700,000 today. The article detailed how the scheme was discovered. A new bank examiner from Albany, conducting a routine audit, had noticed discrepancies in the account records. When he investigated further, the false accounts became apparent. But the most chilling part of the article was buried in the third paragraph. Sources close to the investigation report that Mr. Garrett's eldest son, Michael, had worked as a clerk at the bank during the summer of 1884 and may have discovered irregularities in his father's management of accounts. The young man disappeared in August of this year under mysterious circumstances. Sheriff Bradford stated at the time that the disappearance was unrelated to any criminal activity, but questions now arise as to whether young Michael Garrett's knowledge of his father's crimes may have contributed to his fate. Laura read the article 3 times, her horror growing with each pass. Michael had worked at the bank. He'd discovered his father's embezzlement. He'd confronted Joseph, threatened to expose him. And 3 days later, the family posed for a photograph with Michael's hand visible beneath the porch where they stood. She found the follow-up articles documenting Joseph Garrett's trial in December 1885. He was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud and sentenced to 10 years in the state prison at Auburn. His property was seized to repay some of the stolen funds. His wife Mary and the 4 surviving children were left destitute, their social standing destroyed along with their fortune. But nowhere in any of the trial coverage was Michael's disappearance mentioned as anything more than a footnote. A son who had run away before his father's crimes came to light. The prosecutor never suggested that Joseph might have killed Michael to prevent exposure. The defense never had to explain why the boy had vanished just days before threatening to reveal his father's fraud. Laura found Joseph Garrett's death certificate. He died in Auburn prison in 1889, 4 years into his sentence. Cause of death? Pneumonia. He was 53 years old. He had taken whatever he knew about Michael's fate to his grave, but the photograph remained. That impossible, terrible photograph showing a family posing while beneath them, hidden in the crawl space under the porch, someone was still alive. Someone whose hand reached desperately through the gap between floorboards, whose presence the family acknowledged through the rigid terror in their faces, even as they maintained the fiction that everything was normal. Laura needed to know, had Michael been alive when that photograph was taken? Had he been trapped under that porch, injured, unable to escape, while his family stood above him pretending he didn't exist? Or was the hand reaching from a corpse, hidden in the darkness where his father had left it? The only way to know for certain was to find the farmhouse, if it still stood, and search beneath that porch. Laura drove to Palmyra on a cold morning in early April, the photograph printed in high resolution on the passenger seat beside her. The Wayne County Historical Preservation Office had helped her identify the exact location of the Garrett farm using property maps from 1885, cross-referenced with modern GPS coordinates. The farmhouse still stood. It was abandoned now, had been empty for years according to the property records. The current owner, a development company based in Rochester, had purchased the land with plans to build a subdivision that had never materialized. The house sat alone on 5 acres. The rest of the original 240-acre farm long since sold off and converted to other uses. Laura parked at the end of the overgrown driveway and approached on foot. The house looked much as it had in 1885. White clapboard siding, though now peeling and weathered. The decorative trim was mostly intact. And the porch, that terrible porch, still stretched across the front of the house, its floorboards gray with age and neglect. She'd obtained permission from the property owner to conduct a historical survey, though she hadn't explained exactly what she was looking for. Now she stood at the base of the porch steps, comparing the structure before her with the photograph from 139 years ago. The posts were the same, the railing matched. This was definitely the place. Laura had brought equipment, a powerful LED flashlight, a pry bar, work gloves, and her camera. She also had her phone ready to call the police, though she wasn't sure what she expected to find after nearly a century and a half. The porch was about 3 feet off the ground, the space beneath enclosed by lattice that had long since rotted away. Laura knelt at the edge and shone her flashlight into the crawl space. The ground beneath was bare earth, dark and musty. She could see the underside of the porch floorboards, the floor joists, and farther back, the stone foundation of the house. She crawled under, moving carefully, her flashlight sweeping across the space. The crawl space was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 5 feet high at its tallest point near the foundation, sloping down to about 3 feet at the porch's outer edge. There was room for someone to crouch here, to move around, to... Laura's flashlight beam caught something, a shape that didn't belong. She moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Partially buried in the dirt, about 6 feet from where the family would have stood for the photograph, was a human skeleton. It was curled on its side, one arm extended upward toward the floorboards, the hand positioned exactly where Laura had seen it in the photograph, fingers reaching through the gap between boards. The skeleton was incomplete, disturbed by time and animals, but enough remained to tell the story. Laura sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face. She'd found Michael Garrett. He'd been here for 139 years. Buried in the darkness beneath his family's porch, his hand frozen in its final desperate gesture. She called the police. The Wayne County Medical Examiner arrived within 2 hours, followed by the county sheriff and a forensic anthropology team from the University of Rochester. They worked methodically, documenting the scene, carefully excavating the remains, preserving every detail that might tell them what had happened in August 1885. Laura watched from the yard, answering questions, explaining how she'd found the location. She showed them the photograph, pointing out the hand visible between the floorboards, explaining the family history and Joseph Garrett's embezzlement conviction. The sheriff, a woman in her 40s named Karen Michaels, studied the photograph for a long time. "So, you think the father killed him and hid him under the porch?" Michaels asked. "I think Michael discovered his father's fraud at the bank," Laura said. "He threatened to expose it. They fought, and somehow Michael ended up under that porch, probably severely injured. The photograph was taken 2 days later. That hand, her voice broke. That hand was reaching up while his family stood above him. Whether he was still alive at that moment or whether his father had already killed him, I don't know. But they knew he was there. You can see it in their faces. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. James Chen, completed his preliminary examination that evening. He was a thin man in his 60s, with careful, gentle hands and a voice that matched. He called Laura and Sheriff Michaels over to where he'd laid out the skeleton on a tarp. Male, approximately 16 to 18 years old, consistent with Michael Garrett's age, Dr. Chen began. I can tell you several things with reasonable certainty. First, cause of death, severe trauma. To the skull, you can see the fracture here. He pointed to a crack running across the back of the skull, consistent with being struck with a heavy object, probably something like a hammer or iron bar. The blow would have been fatal, though not necessarily immediately. Laura felt sick. How long would he have survived? That's impossible to say precisely, but the positioning of the remains tells us something significant. His arm is extended upward, hand reaching toward the floorboards. This isn't how you'd position someone if they were already dead. A corpse doesn't reach. This suggests he was alive when he was put under the porch, possibly conscious, trying to signal for help. Sheriff Michaels was writing in her notebook. So the father could have struck him during the fight the neighbor overheard, then hidden him under the porch while he was still alive but dying? That's consistent with the evidence, Dr. Chen confirmed. There's more. Look at the fingers of the extended hand. You can see scratches on the bones, marks where he scraped against the wood repeatedly. He was trying to push through that gap, trying to make noise, trying to be seen or heard. The photograph captured one of those moments. Laura looked at the 1885 photograph again, seeing it with new horror. The family standing rigid above, maintaining the fiction of normalcy for the camera. And below them, Michael dying slowly in the darkness, his hand pushing desperately through the only gap he could reach, hoping someone would see, would help, would save him. How long would he have survived under there? Laura asked quietly. Dr. Chen's expression was pained. With a skull fracture of this severity, hours at most, possibly a day or two, he would have been in and out of consciousness in tremendous pain and completely unable to escape. The crawl space was too confined, and with his injury, he wouldn't have had the strength to break through the floorboards. The discovery made national news. A 139-year-old murder, solved by photograph, ran the headlines. The story had everything. Family betrayal, financial fraud, a desperate victim's silent testimony preserved in an old photograph. News crews descended on Palmyra. Historians and true crime enthusiasts flooded Laura's email with questions and theories. But Laura was focused on one thing, finding out what the family had known. Michael's siblings, Robert, Elizabeth, Caroline, and Sarah, had all been present when that photograph was taken. They'd stood on that porch knowing their brother was beneath them. What had they been told? What had they understood? And had any of them ever tried to tell the truth? The answer came from an unexpected source. A woman named Jennifer Martinez contacted Laura through the Historical Society. Jennifer was Sarah Garrett's great-granddaughter, and she had something Laura needed to see. They met at a coffee shop in Rochester. Jennifer was in her early 40s, a high school teacher with kind eyes and nervous hands. She set a small wooden box on the table between them. "My grandmother gave this to me before she died," Jennifer explained. She was Sarah's granddaughter. Sarah died when my grandmother was 30 years old in 1963. My grandmother said that just before Sarah died, she asked to speak with her alone. She was in and out of lucidity at that point, very frail. But she told my grandmother there was something she needed to pass on, something the family had hidden for almost 80 years. Jennifer opened the box. Inside was a bundle of papers, yellowed and fragile, tied with a faded ribbon. Sarah wrote this in 1942. She was 65 years old, and she'd just been diagnosed with heart disease. She thought she was dying. Turned out she lived another 21 years, but she believed she was facing her final judgment and couldn't go to God without confessing what she knew. Laura's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the first page. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "My name is Sarah Garrett Martinez, and I must confess to knowledge of a terrible crime. In August of 1885, when I was 8 years old, my father murdered my brother Michael and forced our family to help conceal his crime. I have lived 77 years with this burden, and I cannot die without telling the truth that no one would hear when I was a child." The confession was 10 pages long, written in painful detail. Sarah described the night of August 15th, 1885, hearing the fight between her father and Michael, hearing the terrible sound of Michael's scream cut short, seeing her father drag Michael's unconscious body out to the porch in the darkness. "Father told us Michael had attacked him and he'd defended himself," Sarah wrote. "He said Michael was still breathing but badly hurt, and if we called for a doctor or the sheriff, they would arrest father and our family would be ruined. He said Michael had threatened to destroy us all with lies about the bank, that Michael had become dangerous and unstable. He made Mother and Robert help him put Michael under the porch, said they would keep him there until he came to his senses." Sarah's confession detailed the horror of the days that followed. Michael had regained consciousness under the porch, had begun calling out, begging for help. Joseph had told the family that Michael was hysterical, that they must ignore his cries until he calmed down. He'd forbidden anyone from giving Michael water or checking on him. I heard my brother calling for Mother, Sarah wrote. I heard him crying, saying he couldn't see, that his head hurt terribly, that he was afraid. Mother wept but did nothing. Father had convinced her that helping Michael would destroy the family, that if the truth came out, we would all starve in the streets. She chose us over him. By the second day, Michael's voice had weakened. By the third day, the day the photographer came, he was mostly silent, making only occasional sounds. Joseph had insisted they proceed with the family portrait he'd scheduled weeks earlier, before any of this had happened. To cancel would raise suspicions, he'd said. They had to appear normal. We stood on that porch, and I could feel my brother beneath my feet, Sarah's confession continued. I could hear him breathing, ragged and wet. I knew he was dying. When the photographer was arranging us, I looked down and I saw Michael's hand. He'd pushed it up through the gap between the boards. His fingers were moving just slightly, still trying to reach us. I wanted to scream, to grab the photographer and tell him what was happening, but Father's eyes were on me, and I was 8 years old and terrified, so I stayed silent. The photographer had taken the picture. The hand was visible in the image, though partially obscured by shadow. When the finished portrait was delivered 2 weeks later, Joseph had seen it and immediately ordered that the photograph be destroyed. But it was too late. The photographer had made multiple prints, and one had survived, passed through estate sales and family dispersals until it landed in Laura's hands 139 years later. Michael had died late on the evening of August 17, 1885, probably hours after the photograph was taken. Joseph had buried him deeper under the porch that night, covering the grave with lime and stones. The official story was that Michael had run away. When Joseph's embezzlement was discovered 3 months later, the family's shame became total. They'd lost everything, their fortune, their reputation, their standing in the community. But we'd lost something far more valuable long before that, Sarah wrote. We lost our souls when we let Michael die beneath our feet. I have never forgiven myself. I have never forgiven my mother or father or older brother for what we did. The other children, Elizabeth and Caroline, were too young to fully understand what was happening. But Robert and I knew. We knew, and we said nothing. Sarah's confession ended with a plea. If anyone ever finds Michael's remains, please give him a proper burial. Please say his name. Please let the world know that he was brave and good, that he tried to do the right thing, and that his family failed him in the most terrible way possible. His name was Michael Robert Garrett. He was 16 years old, and he deserved so much better than what we gave him. Laura sat in the coffee shop with tears streaming down her face, reading Sarah's words again and again. Jennifer was crying too, her hand over her mouth. She tried to tell people. Jennifer said, "My grandmother told me that Sarah went to the police in 1920, after Joseph and Mary had both died. She tried to tell them what had happened, tried to get them to search under the porch. But by then the farm had been sold, and she was an elderly woman with no proof, claiming her father had committed murder 40 years earlier. They didn't believe her. They thought she was confused or delusional." 6 weeks after the discovery, Michael Garrett's remains were buried in Palmyra Cemetery with full honors. The Historical Society organized the service, and more than 300 people attended. Historians, activists, descendants of the other families involved in the story, and people who simply believed that Michael deserved to be remembered. Laura arranged for a headstone with an inscription based on Sarah's words. Michael Robert Garrett, 1869 to 1885. He tried to do the right thing. We remember him. The 1885 photograph was donated to the National Museum of American History, where it became part of an exhibition on hidden histories and the ways photographs can preserve truths their subjects tried to hide. The museum's display included the full story: the embezzlement, the murder, Sarah's confession, and the forensic evidence that confirmed how Michael had died. Standing at the exhibition's opening, Laura looked at the photograph one last time. That hand reaching up from the darkness was no longer just a disturbing detail in an old picture. It was Michael's testimony, his refusal to disappear, his silent witness that had finally, after 139 years, been heard. The family had tried to erase him. Joseph Garrett had buried him in darkness. Mary and Robert had allowed it to happen, and for decades the truth had remained hidden beneath silence and shame. But Michael's hand, frozen in that desperate reach toward light and life, had preserved the evidence that would eventually reveal everything. "You were seen," Laura whispered to the photograph. "Your family tried to make you disappear, but you were seen, and now everyone knows your name." The hand in the photograph seemed almost to be reaching toward her across the centuries, not in desperation anymore, but in gratitude that someone had finally understood its message and brought the truth into the light where it belonged.